The Long Road to Longbourn. A Pride and Prejudice Variation by Renata McMann and Summer Hanford. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. Wickham. George Wickham used his turn as dealer as an opportunity to study the three men seated with him. The late hour rendered the Meryton Inn's common room empty of all but his table and the weary innkeeper. A haze of smoke, the product of cheap candles, firewood, and cheroot, hung about the room. Wickham's companions watched his hands through blurry, bloodshot eyes, fixated, looking for any indication he was cheating. They could look all they liked. They'd find no wrongdoing on his part. For once he didn't even need to consider cheating. He was winning. More than he ever had before. Enough that he could pay off all his IOUs or all his debts in Meryton. Better still, he'd played with different men all evening. With him winning so much, no one had remained long. It would be days, if ever, that anyone gathered enough gossip to have an idea how well he'd done tonight. Only one hand remained, one more fleecing of these last few desperate fellows. Then he'd go. He'd already told them as much. This sort needed that warning. They either wouldn't or couldn't walk away from a game of cards. Sorry sods. Wickham had learned long since that the best way to handle men like them was a drawn-out, oft-mentioned departure. He dealt the cards, picked his up, and flashed an evil grin, quickly suppressed. In truth, he had nothing. His luck had finally run out. They didn't need to know that, though. "I fold," the one to his right said, and slapped his cards down on the table. Wickham looked to see the man across from him studying his face. The one to his left seemed too drunk to know if his hand would play or not. Wickham slid a few coins into the middle of the table. The man across from him cursed. He slapped his cards down and pushed back his chair, pent-up anger sending the rickety bit of furniture skidding away. "I've had enough," he declared, and stomped away. Wickham shrugged. He turned back to the man on his left. "Are you in?" "What?" The mumbled question was accompanied by rapid blinking. "Are you playing that hand?" Wickham pressed. "He's not," the fellow to Wickham's right said. "Come on, Walt. Let's get you home so your wife can have at you." He offered Wickham a nod. "No hard feelings. We'll win it back tomorrow." Wickham grinned, nodded, and gathered up the cards. He waited for the other three to be well gone before standing from the table. Feeling generous, he tossed the half-asleep innkeeper a coin as he headed out into the night. Or, if he was any judge, the early morning. Projecting easy confidence in case anyone watched him with avaricious ideas, Wickham sauntered back to his room. Once there, he locked the door and wedged the cramped space's lone chair against the thin wood. He set about removing the notes he'd won from various places about his person, making a pile on the bed. Then he sat down to gleefully count. Once satisfied he had an accurate total, Wickham pulled off his boots. They were special, his boots. For one, he'd commissioned them with a down payment from the funds old Mr. Darcy had left him. For another, he'd stiffed the Derbyshire cobbler. Sure, Mr. Darcy the younger, Wickham's one-time friend, would pay the debt. Knowing the stuffy, upright, holier-than-thou Mr. Darcy had paid for boots specially made with secret pockets to hold oftentimes ill-gotten gains, filled Wickham with glee. He stuffed all but £7 of his cash into the boots. They barely had enough room to hold it all and still fit back on his feet. He flexed his toes, enjoying the feel of so much money along his calves and ankles. Yes, it was more than enough to pay either his debts in town or his IOUs to his fellow militiamen. Either way, he'd even have a little left over. He wiggled his toes and tried to choose which debts to satisfy. Logically, he should pay his IOUs. The regiment would soon be headed to Brighton. If he stiffed the merchants of Meryton, he'd never be welcome there again, but why would he ever want to return to such a countrified backwater? Better to have the men of his regiment think him honest, and willing to gamble with him more. An evil smile crept across his face. Why part with any of his winnings? He'd earned them, after all. He'd played fiendishly well all evening, for hours, while lesser men threw themselves against his skill and broke like waves. Waves of winning. Wickham gave his head a little shake, reflecting he could have done with a touch less to drink. Still, the idea was sound. He shouldn't give up any of his hard-earned coin. Instead, he would leave, part with all his debts, and keep all his money. With quick, sure movements, he went about the little room and gathered his possessions, stuffing them into a carpet-bag which overflowed. He put the few things that didn't fit into a sack. Then he moved the chair, unlocked the door, grabbed the bag and sack, and crept from the room. In moments, he was back out on the street, no one the wiser. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the sky was a bit lighter in the east. A glance down the street showed the stirrings of morning. A shabbily dressed man with a ladder was putting out the few guttering street-lights the town boasted. A supply wagon had pulled up alongside the inn. Neither of those were of use to Wickham. He walked a bit farther, pace quick, toward the edge of town. He'd keep walking if he had to, but he'd prefer a faster, less strenuous option. 2 streets down he found a somewhat squat man, with rough-cut hair and nondescript workman's garb, loading a wagon. The man wasn't tall, but looked strong. They'd be even in a fight, if no one cheated. Wickham plastered an amiable expression on his face and sauntered over. "Where are you headed?" The man shot him a quick, assessing look. "Southeast." "Mind if I join you?" Wickham asked. "If you let me ride with you, I'll buy you a bit of food on the way." The man shrugged. "Put your stuff in the wagon," he said, and went back to hoisting sacks. Wickham threw his luggage in the back of the wagon, then went around to climb up. While he carried all his money on his person, he didn't like the idea of his possessions in a wagon he wasn't on board. Besides, if the fellow wanted help loading, all he need do was ask. Wickham would be happy to negotiate the service. Apparently the man didn't want help loading. He was slow enough about tossing in the small pile of sacks that Wickham started to sweat. He didn't want anyone to wake early and see him about to depart. Finally, the fellow loaded the last sack and came around to climb onto the hard bench beside Wickham. "Name's Smith. Yours?" Wickham saw no reason to lie, especially since, if the man had been around town at all, he might already know. "Wickham." "Where are you going to?" Smith flicked the reins and set the team moving. Truth very often bred trust. Wickham gave an exaggerated wince and offered a dollop of honesty. "It's more a matter of going from. I'm in the militia, and many of my fellow officers hold my IOUs." Smith looked at him askance. "They can't put you in a debtor prison for that." "No, but they can make my life miserable." Wickham let out a long-suffering sigh. "I won enough last night to pay a few of them off, but not all of them. And everyone will want to be paid. It occurred to me, well, it's easier to leave." An avaricious glint that Wickham recognized well sparked in Smith's eyes. "How much did you win?" £6 and a couple of shillings. Wickham made sure to sound proud, like he was boasting. In truth, he'd won much more. He'd put £6 and change in his wallet, though. Smith's interest dimmed. "Don't forget you offered to pay for lunch." "Yes, but I didn't say you could have whatever you like," Wickham countered. They reached the edge of town and headed southeast. The horizon glowed like an open flame. but the golden orb of the sun still lurked below, out of sight. Smith's team, well past their prime, plodded forward at a slow pace. They took turns driving and stopped often to rest the team. Wickham wasn't really worried about being followed. No one would realize he'd left for quite some time. Still, each delay made him nervous. He didn't see why the quarter-full wagon, the sacks turning out to be cabbages, necessitated such slow going. The sun still lingered just low enough to be in Wickham's eyes when Smith, who was driving, turned them down a farm lane. Wickham's worries returned. Could this be as far as the man meant to go? Wickham would have trouble flagging down a new ride, and they were still uncomfortably near Meryton. "You farm?" Wickham asked, endeavouring for a casual note. "Just a little more cargo." Wickham relaxed in relief. He even helped Smith and the dour old farmer load the small collection of sacks, leeks this time, into the wagon. They climbed back in and resumed their course. The next time they rested the team, Smith didn't request a change of driver. Wickham didn't mind. Driving was more work than riding, after all. When they set out again, Smith went only a short way before turning down a narrow trail, hardly wide enough for the wagon. New concerns sprang to life in Wickham's gut. They were going east now, toward the sea, which glittered on the horizon before them. The trail was steep, much more so than a man would risk for any honest purpose. Did Smith mean to accost Wickham for his possessions and £7, then toss his body in the water? The trail sliced through a hill, the wagon occasionally grating on the steep walls. Wickham looked about for a possible weapon, a large rock or a branch, anything. They came out onto a rocky cove. Smith drew the wagon to a halt. A ship was anchored in the narrow bay. It had the look of a wealthy man's private vessel, built more for speed and comfort than for cargo. A small boat was beached beside stacked casks, presided over by two somewhat rough-looking men. At the sight of Smith and his wagon, the two men each hoisted a cask and headed up the beach. Smith jumped out and started removing his meagre stacks of vegetables. Smugglers, Wickham realized. From the look of the casks, he guessed brandy, French contraband. "Give me a hand," Smith called. Wickham craned his neck to look over his shoulder. Somehow his bag was now on the ground, pinned under one of the vegetable piles. He glanced back at the two approaching men. Neither they nor Smith seemed to be armed. He could leave his possessions and run. But why? Smuggling brandy wasn't a real crime, not like robbery, kidnapping, or murder. Most magistrates drank the stuff, after all. Wickham climbed down and went to help Smith remove the rest of the sacks. Once the wagon bed was empty, Smith pulled up the bottom to reveal a secret compartment, deep enough for the casks. The two men reached them, both eyeing Wickham. "Who's he?" one asked, while the other deposited his cask. "He's all right," Smith said. While that didn't answer the question, it appeared to be enough for the man. He nodded and stowed his cask as well. Both men trudged back down the beach toward the stack of casks. "Come on," Smith said, and headed toward the sea. Wickham shrugged and followed. When he reached the pile, he hefted a cask to his shoulder. He tried not to reveal the effort it cost him. Smith lifted his with ease, just like the other two. Wickham reflected that maybe they wouldn't be evenly matched in a fight after all. Certainly, he couldn't take all three. He imagined he was faster than any of them, though, light and lean. Hopefully he wouldn't need to find out. When all the brandy was loaded and the vegetables and Wickham's possessions back in the wagon, the four of them met halfway up the rocky beach. The two men eyed Wickham again, as if assessing his continued value now that the wagon was loaded. He offered an ingratiating smile. Jeb find any new buyers?" one of the men asked, turning to Smith. "Not yet." Smith's tone held annoyance. "Says the parson he works for isn't called on by anyone but some old lady and a spinster daughter, and they're too sanctimonious to buy smuggled goods." "But you got someone in London for this load, right?" the other man asked. "Aye, all lined up." Smith nodded. "London's getting full up, is all. Competition's driving down the price. Ain't hardly worth the trouble." "Well, tell Jeb to make himself useful," the first man muttered. "We need a new buyer. I ain't risking my hide for pennies." He turned and marched back toward the small boat they'd beached. Wickham wagered the little vessel, a rowboat of some sort, only held 2 men, or 1 man and brandy. Out in the bay, the larger vessel bobbed in time with the waves. He hadn't noted anyone on it as they loaded the casks, but that didn't mean it was empty. The remaining man nodded to Smith. "See you?" He broke off, with a glance at Wickham. "Next time," he settled. He followed the first man to the boat, which they pushed out to sea. Smith turned to Wickham, arms folded across his chest. "I'm off to London now. My brother usually goes with me, but he's otherwise employed. I could use an extra set of hands. Keeps anyone with unlawful intentions at bay." Wickham watched as the other 2 men got through the crashing waves, one rowing vigorously. "So I'd be an asset," Wickham suggested, foregoing mention of the irony of Smith's wish to avoid the unlawful. Smith's gaze shifted toward the other 2 as well, likely with the same thought as Wickham. They were back to one-on-one. It would take the other 2 men a bit of time and effort to return to the shore. He turned back to Wickham with a grudging shrug. "I'll pay you a shilling a day and feed you." "Day's nearly over," Wickham noted. He didn't fancy a long ride in the dark, just so Smith could get the most out of his first day. "I know some place a couple miles from here." Meals and drink. Wickham wasn't going to sit on a trove of brandy and go thirsty. Smith gave a curt nod. He turned and headed for the wagon. Wickham figured that meant negotiations were over, so he followed. "Your brother, Jeb, I assume, left because the money isn't good?" he asked as they climbed aboard. Smith flicked the reins and set about turning the team. "Got himself a woman, and she got a job at the parsonage, so Jeb got a place there too," Smith said, his focus on his driving. "He's supposed to use his position to find us some rich folk what wants stolen brandy. Thought he might find something worth stealing too, but I don't think he has. Maybe up at the fancy lady's house. Old Bat would probably never notice. What's an old lady and a spinster need with such a big house, I say? They probably don't go in but 10 rooms, if that." He set them back up the narrow trail, the team noticeably straining. Wickham leaned back and watched the team work. His day was getting better by the moment. Not only had he gotten a free ride this far, he'd be paid to go the rest of the way. Even the destination was fortuitous. He wouldn't mind going to London at all. He could check in on some friends and deposit most of his winnings. Despite his specially made boots, he didn't care for keeping so much of his money on his person. The old team plodded up the hill, making it look like enough work that Wickham was happy he didn't have to walk the steep trail. His day was definitely looking up. In fact, his whole week was, maybe even his year. Yes, from here on out, things were going to go well for him. He could feel it. Chapter 2. Darcy. Large as his aunt's favourite parlour was, Darcy still found the room stuffy. Yet his wish to leave had nothing to do with the thick air. He wanted to walk, with a particular destination in mind, and to do so unaccompanied. Seated on one end of a long sofa, window to his back, he scanned his companions over the top edge of a 2-day-old newspaper. He bided his time until the others seemed well occupied. Darcy's cousin Anne and her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson, sat before a second window, sewing. As far as Darcy recalled, they worked on garments for a new babe born into one of the families beholden to Rosings, as his Aunt Catherine's estate was known. Anne's gaze was turned toward her work, but her eyes were glazed over. Darcy knew she'd sown such charitable offerings many times before. Aunt Catherine, known as Lady Catherine de Bourgh to most, engaged in quiet conversation with her new favourite toady, the rector of the local parsonage, Mr. Collins. His presence was one of the reasons Darcy wished to take a stroll. Darcy's goal was Mr. Collins' dwelling, and he'd prefer the tall, paunchy man's absence. The room's only other occupant, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam, cousin to both Darcy and Anne, was Darcy's chief obstacle to an unaccompanied walk. Richard occupied the opposite end of the same sofa on which Darcy sat, likely for the same reason. Light streamed in through the window behind them to make reading easier than in other parts of the gloomy parlour. Richard, too, held a paper before him. He seemed to be doing a much better job of reading than Darcy. Darcy rattled his paper and returned to his perusal of the words. The happenings in the House of Commons lacked their usual import, however. The deeds of parliamentary members couldn't pull his mind from endless contemplation of Miss Elizabeth Bennet and her comments of the evening before. He'd put on an unconcerned face when, while seated at the pianoforte, she'd essentially told him the fault was his if he wasn't competent at socializing with strangers. Her words had stung. They'd sparked annoyance as well. Foremost, for the criticism inherent in them. Second, because they were spoken before his cousin Richard, as if Richard needed more fuel for teasing. Third, because of the easy way Elizabeth and Richard conversed, and the jealousy that camaraderie ignited. Lastly, her words pricked Darcy because her criticism was true. If he practiced socializing more, he would undoubtedly excel at the activity. The aggravating, enchanting Elizabeth Bennet was precisely the person he wished to practice socializing with, but Richard would spoil that. He and Elizabeth couldn't be together without striking up easy conversation. Darcy would be in a terrible fix if Richard were a touch more vehement in his affection for Miss Bennet. Then the choice of taking her for himself, or gifting Richard enough so he could afford to take her, would be upon Darcy. Fortunately, though clearly enchanted, Richard didn't appear enamoured. Richard angled his paper more fully into the light and leaned toward the page, a sure sign he was thoroughly engrossed in an article. Darcy quietly folded his. No one seemed to notice. As casually as he could, he said, "I think I'll stretch my legs," and stood. Richard didn't look up. Lady Catherine's voice droned on. Mr. Collins maintained every appearance of sponging up her words. Anne's eyes stayed glazed over, her hand rising and dipping with each stitch. Mrs. Jenkinson glanced his way, but she wouldn't speak. Darcy started across the room. "Darcy, where are you going?" Lady Catherine asked, tone officious. He kept walking. "To stretch my legs." "Anne, go with Darcy," Lady Catherine ordered. "I'm sewing, mother," Anne protested. "So put your sewing down and walk with Darcy," Lady Catherine said. "You're to marry him, you must spend time with him." Darcy, nearly to the parlour door, halted. With a grimace he pivoted back, turning in time to see the annoyance on Anne's face. Richard still scrutinized the paper, as well he should. He'd heard their cousin and aunt argue over Anne's marrying Darcy well-nigh 200 times. "I am not going to marry Darcy, Mother. We've been over this," Anne snapped. "And I am not going to marry Anne," Darcy added quietly. "That doesn't mean you can't walk together," Lady Catherine declared. She shot Mr. Collins a prompting look. "Quite right. Walking together is only proper and good for the health," Mr. Collins offered. "And you two will come to realize you must marry," Lady Catherine stated. Anne levelled a flat stare at her mother. "No, just because you and Darcy's mother thought it would be nice for us to wed, doesn't mean we feel the same." "Of course you do." Lady Catherine swivelled her formidable, jowly visage toward Darcy. "Right, Darcy?" Richard's paper rattled as he folded it closed. "I say, Darcy, I'll walk with you. I could use a bit of fresh air." Darcy shook his head, irritated on all counts. He addressed his aunt. "I will not marry Anne, and I will take a walk," he stated, and all but stomped from the room. He heard Richard stand as he left. The sound of a folded paper plopping down on a tabletop followed Darcy down the hall. By the time he'd gone for his outerwear, Richard awaited him in the foyer, similarly attired. "Shall we?" Richard asked with a gesture toward the door. The beauty of being known for his lack of social grace was that Darcy could simply nod, his annoyance hidden by his generally laconic nature. Once through the door, Darcy jogged down the step. He set a brisk pace toward the parsonage. Richard might be with him, but Darcy could still see Elizabeth at least. Even if she would spend the call chatting with Richard and leave Darcy to engage in stilted conversation with Mrs. Collins and Miss Maria Lucas, Mrs. Collins' younger sister. Once they were well on their way, Richard cleared his throat. Darcy shot him a quick glance, realizing his cousin had something on his mind. He slowed his pace, interest piqued despite himself. "I was thinking, since we've extended our stay here," Richard began. He cast Darcy a quick, assessing look. "Well, should we invite Georgiana to join us?" Darcy frowned, surprised by the suggestion. "She doesn't care to visit Rosings." His shy, meek little sister, only 15, was generally bowled over by their aunt. Richard cleared his throat again. "Yes, I realize she finds Aunt Catherine daunting. It's simply, after the incident in Ramsgate, I can't help but worry each time she's left too long on her own." Understanding unfurled in Darcy. Georgiana wouldn't make such an error again, he asserted. In truth, she hadn't followed through with her ill-conceived plan the first time. She hadn't run off with George Wickham. She'd told Darcy of the plan instead, and he'd put everything right. Chased off Wickham, fired Georgiana's old governess, and hired a new one. Though nearly disastrous, his little sister's near elopement with Wickham was now safely behind her. Richard stopped walking. "Are you certain? She seemed rather, well, resentful to me, as if she wished she hadn't confessed to you." Darcy stopped as well, and turned to his cousin in surprise. He hadn't realized Richard and Georgiana had spoken on the issue. He'd informed Richard, of course. As Georgiana's co-guardian, Richard deserved to know about her near elopement. "I'm sure she's happy she confessed." Richard shrugged. "I think she's still enamored of Wickham and regrets she didn't go with him. And you never know where that villain will turn up. Mark my words, Darcy, he's not out of your life yet. No, Wickham and I are through. I paid him for the living my father left him at his insistence. I paid his debts in Derbyshire. Under very firm orders, he's not to be given any credit there ever again. I sent him fleeing Ramsgate after he attempted to elope with Georgiana. He wouldn't dare trouble us again." Darcy shook his head. "He was forced to join the militia to make ends meet. They'll keep him out of trouble. With his regiment stationed in the countryside, Georgiana is perfectly safe in London. I guess I want to assuage my guilt over how vastly we almost failed her," Richard finally said. Darcy nodded and resumed walking. "I understand the urge, but forcing Georgiana to endure Lady Catherine seems too harsh a punishment, even for the crime of almost running off with George Wickham. It wasn't his sister's fault she was charmed by the man. Everyone else had been, from Darcy's father to local merchants to the Bennet sisters. I just can't shake the feeling Wickham will come back to haunt you again," Richard said, matching Darcy's stride. "The militia is going to Brighton in a few weeks. I'll take Georgiana to Pemberley. I doubt Wickham has the money to travel that far. He won't bother us again." They fell into companionable silence, Richard's gaze abstract, but as they neared the Hunsford parsonage, his eyes refocused. He glanced about, then darted a look at Darcy. "The Collins? Mr. Collins, as you know, is not at home." "What better time to visit?" Darcy said dryly. His comment earned a wry smile from Richard. They presented themselves at the door. A maid answered and showed them in. They found Mrs. Collins, Elizabeth, and Miss Lucas in the parsonage's small parlour. All three women stood to greet them. Miss Lucas held a ball of yarn, Elizabeth a skein of it. "Mr. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam," Mrs. Collins greeted with a smile and a curtsy. Elizabeth and Miss Lucas also bobbed their greetings. Despite her full hands, Elizabeth managed the act with grace. Miss Lucas fumbled her curtsy, her expression a bit awed. "Mrs. Collins, Miss Bennet, Miss Lucas," Richard greeted, after a pause. Darcy frowned, realizing Richard had given him a heartbeat to reply, then taken the nicety upon himself. For someone practicing his social graces, Darcy wasn't off to a good start. "Mr. Collins is out," Mrs. Collins said. "He's calling on your aunt, I believe." Richard cast Darcy a quick look, then turned back to Mrs. Collins. "Yes, he is. We came out to stretch our legs, and wouldn't you know, they brought us to your doorstep." Intelligent blue eyes, set in a slightly less attractive than average visage, scanned over Darcy and his cousin. "I see," Mrs. Collins said. "Would you care for tea?" "We would be most obliged," Richard said. "I dare say we'll now miss tea at Rosings." "Then do come sit down," Mrs. Collins offered. Soon they were all seated about a low table. Mrs. Collins, Darcy noted, was a very adept hostess. Her manners were exemplary, each movement precise and easy-seeming. She served them in the proper order, asked all the correct questions, and cheerfully prompted conversation. She was wasted on Mr. Collins. Once they were all served, and the topic of weather exhausted, Elizabeth turned her beguiling eyes toward Darcy. He immediately put down his teacup. He also tamped down his pleasure that she should turn to him, and not Richard. "So, Mr. Darcy," her eyes glinted with amusement, "do I dare construe this visit as your attempt to practice social niceties? Are you in fact accepting my advice, however cruelly given?" "You may, and I am," he replied. "Why, this is terrible, then," she proclaimed in bright, mocking tones. "Terrible?" Richard asked before Darcy could speak. "That Darcy should practice, or that he's taken your advice?" Elizabeth turned her attention on Richard. To Darcy's chagrin, "Why, that he should practice," she declared. "Now I must abide by my own advice and practice as well. Only," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I am too proud. I cannot consign myself to the back-room pianoforte, on which your aunt offered to let me practice." "Then humble yourself," Mrs. Collins advised. "Mr. Berg's companion is a wonderful woman. You should be honoured to have the use of the pianoforte in her room." Elizabeth's impertinent smile transformed into a wry grimace. "I stand reprimanded by my oldest friend." "I would be happy to practice on any pianoforte," Miss Lucas said staunchly. But you were not the one invited," Elizabeth quipped, "although Lady Catherine would be happier to have you invade Mrs. Jenkinson's room than me, since you would be more grateful." Mrs. Collins offered her a repressive, if amused look. She turned to Mr. Darcy. "Did you find the walk over pleasant, Mr. Darcy?" "Yes," he said, then fell to wondering what he might say next. He refused to look to Richard. His cousin was certain to have a topic, but Darcy was determined to speak. "You must make the walk often," he finally added. "We do, although your aunt orders the carriage for our return. She is the soul of generosity with her carriage, company, and advice." "Especially her advice," Elizabeth murmured. "And the carriage is for leaving Rosings, but not for coming to Rosings. I'm not certain what message that conveys." Miss Lucas giggled. "This parsonage is also a splendid stop while on a ride," Richard stated. "If you deem it so, then you must by all means view it as such." Mrs. Collins accompanied her words with a smile that made them seem genuine. "We should be delighted to have you two gentlemen visit as often as you like." "The pleasure will be ours," Richard replied, grin charming. Darcy wished Richard wouldn't turn that grin on Elizabeth, but he did. Darcy was possessed with the odd urge to scowl at his cousin. He repressed the desire, but couldn't make it recede as tea went on. Richard continued to banter lightly with all three women, even drawing Miss Lucas into a smattering of conversation. Darcy didn't manage to get in 4 more words. Not that he knew what words he would say. He could have thought of some, though, if Richard weren't always speaking. They rose to leave after a long half-hour. Darcy could feel Elizabeth's eyes on him as he bowed to the room, but could think of nothing to say other than farewell. No witty words, not even an appropriate expression. A smile would be too forward, a frown was uncalled for. He settled for calm reserve, an image he endeavoured to maintain as he and Richard set off toward Rosings, his cousin chatting amiably about their visit and Elizabeth's loveliness the whole way. Chapter 3. Wickham. Despite how dank the subterranean London room was, Wickham deferred the steep steps to Smith and the burly gentleman who'd unlocked the cellar door. By his count, 1 more cask needed to be removed from the wagon to complete the order. Whoever ascended to the street first would undoubtedly take it down, whereas all the other 2 would need do was toss the remaining vegetables on top. That work had grown easier, Smith having sold the cabbages. Sure enough, Smith descended with the final cask as Wickham climbed free of the cellar. He stretched before joining the burly man in moving sacks of leeks. He wondered if smuggling always involved so much labour. Wickham had done more than enough work for a whole day, and the sun wasn't even up yet. The burly man, who'd neither given nor asked for names, eyed Wickham in mistrustful silence while they waited for Smith. Upon his return, a packet of bills was exchanged. Smith gestured to Wickham, and they climbed back into the wagon. With a flick of the reins, the somewhat rested team moved away from the mouth of the alley. "Where can I drop you?" Smith asked. "Only don't make it out of the way." Charing Cross will do. Wickham wanted somewhere he knew, and that would be crowded even at this time of day. Despite their travels so far, he didn't trust Smith. Now that Wickham's usefulness was truly over, he wouldn't put it past the other man to rob him. Charing Cross, then? Wickham watched their route closely, to be certain Smith intended to take him where he'd asked to go, not down some dark street where more of his questionable associates waited. Traffic picked up as they drew near their destination. The shadows draping alley mouths and storefronts grew less murky, with the diffuse light of false dawn. Wickham started to relax. I'll be needing more help tomorrow once I find a buyer for the rest, and there'll be a new load to pick up soon enough, Smith said as they waited for a wagon-load of crates to pass. Wickham didn't reply. He knew what Smith was getting at. He wasn't sure he wanted to turn smuggler, but he was sure that making the man ask would begin negotiations in his favour. You'll be available to help? Wickham shrugged. Could be. I'll keep paying and feeding you. I want £1 a day, Wickham declared. Smith shot him a startled look. The wagon of crates moved out of the way. A nearby coachman hollered a curse at them for holding up traffic. Smith snapped the reins and set his team moving. £1 a day is robbery. It was, but it was a good start to the negotiations. And food. I'll pay you £1 a day and food like I was. Wickham took in the stubborn set of Smith's jaw. He weighed the amount of work he'd done. 7 shillings a day and food, and we don't always sleep on the road. 2 shillings a day, and I get to decide what we eat, Smith countered. He cast a quick, surly look Wickham's way. And how much ale I pay for. Make that 4 shillings and all the drink I want, and you have a deal, Wickham countered. I'll make it 3 on my terms. Done. 3 shillings a day, meals of your choosing, drink, and we don't always sleep on the road. Smith gave a sharp nod. He pulled the wagon off to the side of the street, somewhat out of traffic. They hadn't quite reached Hungerford Market, dense with wagons and carts in the early morning rush to unload. Wickham inhaled the thick London air, at home with the cacophony of horses, men, wagons, and rustling wares. Smith pointed to the cornermost market stall. Be there tomorrow, an hour before sunrise. I won't wait. I'll get my luggage, Wickham said. Smith nodded. Wickham jumped out and went around for his possessions, not too hurried. Smith wouldn't get anywhere quickly in the press around the market. As soon as Wickham had his luggage, Smith set the wagon moving toward the market. Wickham imagined he meant to sell the leeks, and didn't fancy paying for help unloading them. That suited him, as he didn't fancy doing any more work that morning. Whistling as he walked, Wickham went first to an old acquaintance who could be relied upon to keep most of his things without rummaging through them or selling them for a small fee. The rate was good, and sweetened by a little flattery. What she really wanted was the lie that she still held a lure. A kiss and a wink, and he'd offloaded everything he didn't need for travelling with Smith, which was a relief. Even the brief walk had been overly cumbersome with his possessions, especially after his early morning exertions. Next he found himself a quick meal while he waited for the bank to open. Old Mr. Darcy had helped Wickham set up an account years ago. The £100 the old man had given him to start the account hadn't lasted long. The £1,000 he'd inherited upon old Mr. Darcy's death, not much longer. A slow smile spread across Wickham's face. Now, the 3,000 he'd gotten out of Darcy for giving up the living old Mr. Darcy had left him in Derbyshire, that had been a tidy sum. 8 whole pounds of that still remained in the bank. The money Wickham carried in his boots, which he wouldn't remove until safely in a back room at the bank, would in no way replenish the 3,000, but it was a nice addition to the 8. Wickham lingered over his breakfast until the bank opened, then went in and made his deposit, keeping a bit for his boots and even less for his purse. After that he called on a woman he knew, the green ribbon tying back her curtains, a sure sign of welcome. Her husband worked the canals and often left her alone and lonely. Over the years, Wickham had been a comfort to her. After a brief conversation on her stoop, she bade him sneak around back, out of sight of the neighbours. There she let him in with a smile, but warned he had to be gone before sunrise, which suited him perfectly. On top of her usual accommodating nature, she fed him both lunch and dinner, and helped him launder his spare set of clothes. When morning neared, he crept away with a smile, feeling magnanimous enough to leave a few farthings by her pillow. With no other prospects and his errands in London complete, Wickham decided he would meet Smith. He'd already smuggled, after all. A bit more couldn't hurt, and Smith didn't make the task too arduous. Plus, Wickham felt he'd struck a reasonably good deal in food and wages. Smith met him as arranged, and they went to an even seedier part of town than the morning before. This time they had to pass the casks through a basement window to men Wickham never saw. That suited him better than the steps, and there were no vegetables to reload. Overall, as they left London in the early morning light, Wickham felt he'd made the right choice by going with Smith. They reached an open stretch of roadway, past the bulk of traffic rumbling into London, full of wares for the day. Wickham slumped in his seat, the sun warmer beyond London's fog. He fancied a nap before Smith made him take a turn driving. Smith yawned. "Tell me about yourself, Wickham. Where'd you grow up? How does a fellow who talks and dresses all gentlemanlike end up smuggling brandy?" Wickham grimaced, but sat up straighter. "That's the crux of things, isn't it? I talk like a gentleman. I look like a gentleman. I have the tastes of a gentleman, but I am not one." Smith shot him a glance. "No? I took you for a third son or some such. If only. Even a third son wouldn't be so ill-used as I." "And who's been using you ill?" Smith said, tone touched with disbelief. "You look fine enough to me. Fancy boots, hat, clothes, heavy bag full of things when you took up with me. I should know. I moved it in and out of the wagon enough times." "Oh, yes, I have all that." Wickham let out a heartfelt sigh. He had a relatively good notion where Smith was going with his questions, but didn't mind expounding on one of his favourite topics, the world's injustice toward him. "My father was a steward, you see, but also a great friend to his master, Mr. Darcy the elder. I was also a great favourite of old Mr. Darcy's. I'm named after him, and he was my godfather." "Must be mighty nice to have a godfather who's a gentleman," Smith observed. The team plodded down the road with an even gait, noticeably sprier with the empty wagon. The gentle sway and predictable squeak of their conveyance lulled, but Wickham would rather educate a willing audience on the wrongs of his life than sleep. "You would think, but no," he continued with feeling. "Mr. Darcy raised me right alongside his son, the now Mr. Darcy. We were good friends through our childhood. Things didn't go wrong until Cambridge." "The gentleman sent you to school?" Smith broke in, clearly surprised. "He did favour you?" "Aye, which is why his son detests me, among other not as important reasons. Now that old Mr. Darcy is gone, I'm left destitute. Mr. Darcy the younger took back every gift the old man bestowed on me." "You can't take back an education," Smith observed. "Would that you could. I would be a simpler man," Wickham countered, deliberately misconstruing Smith's meaning. Wickham preferred not to dwell on how he'd squandered the opportunity of Cambridge. Not that he cared. Any employment he could find with that sort of education would require tedious work. Smith favoured him with another sideways look. "Still, you must know a lot of rich folk. Leastwise well enough to know who might want some fine French brandy." Wickham hid a smile. He'd guessed that was Smith's goal in his questions. More buyers. Instead of getting what he wanted, Smith had fallen into Wickham's trap by opening the door for some of his favourite rants. He started with the horrors of the aloof, stuffy, supercilious, pompous Mr. Darcy. Next he moved on to that old hedgehog, Lady Catherine. It wasn't until late in the day, after many stops to rest, changes of driver and lunch, that they reached talk of the Earl of Matlock's estate. Smith wanted every detail about the estates and their owners. The more Wickham talked, the more questions Smith had. Finally, it occurred to Wickham that he may not have played Smith as well as he'd thought. Yes, Wickham was getting to voice years of complaints to a willing listener, but Smith's questions had a certain predictability by the third round of descriptions. They leaned toward the estate owner's habits and security in a way that began to make Wickham leery. But what did he care? It was nothing to him if Darcy, the Earl, or Lady Catherine got robbed. So long as Smith didn't ask Wickham to help carry out the deed, he didn't care what happened to three wealthy people's knickknacks, coins, and baubles. They all had more than they needed or knew what to do with, anyhow. Smith murmured, mulling over Wickham's description of Matlock's guardsmen and footmen and their routine patrols inside the Earl's homes, outside them and around the perimeters of his estates. "But the old lady who lives alone with her daughter, she must not have so many guards about?" Smith drove again, his hands loose on the reins. "Don't think because Lady Catherine is a widow living alone that there is less security," Wickham said. The sun was getting lower. He hoped Smith planned for this to be a night they stopped at an inn. All the talking of the day had made Wickham thirsty. "So you said—" Smith didn't sound convinced. "She is only alone in the sense that she has only one family member in the house, although at this time of year her nephews should be visiting as well," Wickham cautioned. "She has many footmen, and they don't just stand around. They patrol the place regularly. She is well aware that people might believe her to be an easy target. She would take considerable pleasure in catching housebreakers, and having met the lady, I tell you with absolute certainty that she would use every ounce of her influence to see a housebreaker hung." Smith nodded, silent. Ahead, a building started to take shape on the horizon. Wickham hoped it was an inn or even a town. He glanced about and realized he hadn't been keeping proper track of their journey. "Which nephews?" Smith asked. "I believe you said she has 3, and one's an earl." Smith was considering kidnapping, too, Wickham guessed. Well, Matlock would fetch a good sum, and be somewhat easier to secure at Rosings than one of his own residences, but he didn't visit there. The Earl and Lady Catherine didn't get on. 2 goats they were. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam. The Earl's younger brother. Wickham liked Colonel Fitzwilliam too well to want him kidnapped and ransomed back to his brother, especially since Matlock might not pay. Lady Catherine would be more likely to, but that was a piece of information